Long ago, before the great flood washed away the world, there lived a man named Enoch. Most people know very little about this mysterious figure from ancient times. But what Enoch saw and wrote down was so shocking, so terrifying to religious leaders, that they banned his book from the Bible. They hid it away for thousands of years. They were afraid of what people would learn if they read Enoch's words. What could be so dangerous about one man's writings? What did Enoch witness that made powerful leaders tremble with fear? The answer lies in a story that goes back to the very beginning of human history. It is a story about angels who fell from heaven. It is about giants who walked the earth and ate people. It is about forbidden knowledge that changed the world forever. This is not just any ordinary story. This is the account of what really happened before the Great Flood. It explains why God had to wash the world clean with water. It tells us about creatures so evil and so powerful that they had to be destroyed completely. And at the center of it all stands one man who saw things that no other human being had ever seen. Enoch was no ordinary person. The Bible tells us that Enoch walked with God. It says that God took him up to heaven while he was still alive. He never died like other people. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. God had taken him away to a place where no human had ever been before. But before Enoch left this world, he wrote down what he had seen. He recorded visions that were given to him by God himself. He described journeys through the heavens that would make your mind spin with wonder. He told of conversations with angels and of standing before the very throne of the Almighty. Most importantly, Enoch wrote about the Watchers. These were special angels that God had placed on the earth to watch over human beings. They were supposed to protect people and help them. But something went terribly wrong. These angels made a choice that would bring disaster upon the entire world. The story begins in the early days of humanity. People were living simple lives, farming the land and raising families. They knew about God, but they did not know much about the spiritual world around them. They could not see the angels that moved among them. They had no idea about the great battle between good and evil that was happening right above their heads. High in the heavenly places, there were angels called Watchers. Their job was very important. They were supposed to watch over the earth and the people on it. They were meant to be guardians, protectors of humanity. God had given them great power and knowledge so they could do their job well. But as these watchers looked down at the earth day after day, something began to change in their hearts. They started to notice the women who lived on the earth. These women were beautiful, and the watchers found themselves thinking about them more and more. Instead of focusing on their duties to God, they began to desire what they were not supposed to have. The leader of these watchers was an angel named Semjaza. He was powerful and respected among the heavenly beings. But Semjaza had a weakness. He looked at the daughters of men and wanted them for himself. He began to think thoughts that angels were not supposed to think. He started making plans that would change everything. There was another angel among the Watchers who was even more dangerous than Semjaza. His name was Azazel. While Semjaza was thinking about beautiful women, Azazel was thinking about power and knowledge. He knew secrets that human beings were not meant to learn. He understood how to make weapons of war. He knew about magic and sorcery. He had knowledge that could destroy the innocence of humanity forever. One day, Semjaza gathered the other watchers around him. There were 200 of these powerful angels in total. Semjaza looked at each one of them and spoke words that would echo through history. He told them about his plan to leave their posts in heaven and come down to earth. He wanted to take human women as wives and live among the people like gods. The other watchers listened to Semjaza's words. Many of them had been having the same thoughts. They too had been watching the beautiful women on earth and wanting them. They had grown tired of their duties in heaven. They wanted to experience what it was like to live as physical beings instead of spirits. But some of the watchers were afraid. They knew that what Semjaza was suggesting was against God's law. Angels were not supposed to leave their positions in heaven. They were not supposed to marry human women. They were certainly not supposed to abandon their duties to God. Semjaza saw their fear and spoke to them again. He told them that if they were going to do this thing, they all had to do it together. None of them could back out once they started. They would all be equally guilty. They would all face the same punishment if God decided to judge them. But they would also all share in the same pleasures if their plan worked. The 200 watchers thought about Semjaza's words. They looked down at the earth and saw the women they desired. They thought about the freedom they would have if they left their posts in heaven. They imagined what it would be like to be worshipped by human beings instead of serving God. One by one, the watchers agreed to Semjaza's plan. They made a pact together, binding themselves with oaths and curses. They promised that they would all descend to earth together. They would all take human wives, and they would all face whatever consequences came from their actions. The decision was made. 200 of God's angels were about to abandon their posts and rebel against their Creator. They had no idea what terrible things would happen because of their choice. They could not see into the future to witness the giants, the violence, the corruption, and the flood that would come. All they could think about was their own desires and their own pleasure. As the watchers prepared to leave heaven, the other angels watched in horror. The good angels tried to warn them about what they were doing. They pleaded with the watchers to change their minds. They reminded them of their duties and their loyalty to God. But the watchers would not listen. Their hearts had been hardened by their own selfish desires. On a day that would live in infamy forever, the 200 watchers spread their wings and began their descent from heaven to earth. They left behind their positions of honor and authority. They abandoned their service to the Most High God. They turned their backs on everything they had been created to do. As they fell through the sky like shooting stars, the watchers felt a mixture of excitement and fear. They were excited about the new lives they were going to live on earth. But deep down, they were also afraid of what God might do to punish them. They tried not to think about the consequences of their actions. They focused instead on the women they would marry and the power they would have among human beings. The people on earth had no idea what was coming. They went about their daily lives, working in their fields, caring for their animals, and raising their children. They looked up at the sky and saw strange lights falling like stars. But they did not understand that these were rebellious angels coming to change their world forever. When the Watchers finally reached the earth, they took on physical forms that looked like men. But these were not ordinary men. They were taller and stronger than any human being. They had knowledge and power that no person on earth had ever seen. They seemed like gods to the simple people who met them. The Watchers quickly spread out across the earth. Each one chose a region where he wanted to live. They began to interact with human beings, and people were amazed by these mysterious strangers. The Watchers could do things that seemed impossible. They knew about the stars and the seasons. They could predict the weather. They seemed to have power over nature itself. It did not take long for the Watchers to start choosing wives from among the human women. They picked the most beautiful women they could find. These women were flattered by the attention of these powerful beings. They had no idea that they were being courted by fallen angels. They thought these mysterious men were just very special human beings. Semjaza chose a woman for himself and made her his wife. Azazel did the same. One by one, all 200 of the Watchers took human women as their wives. They performed marriage ceremonies and began to live as husbands and fathers. They built homes and started families just like the human beings around them. But there was something very different about these marriages. When angels and human beings came together, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the world. The women began to have children, but these were not ordinary children. They were something new and terrifying. The children born to the Watchers and human women were called Nephilim. This word means the fallen ones, or those who fell. These children inherited the supernatural power of their angelic fathers, but they also had the physical nature of their human mothers. The result was creatures that were part angel and part human. As these children grew, it became clear that they were very different from normal human beings. They grew much faster than other children. They became much larger and stronger. By the time they were fully grown, the Nephilim were giants. Some of them were 15 feet tall. Others were even taller than that. They towered over ordinary people, like trees tower over bushes. The size of the Nephilim was frightening enough, but that was not the worst thing about them. These giants had inherited the supernatural abilities of their angel fathers, but they did not have the wisdom or goodness that angels were supposed to have. Instead, they were filled with violence and evil desires. They used their great strength to hurt and terrorize other people. At first, the Nephilim were satisfied with eating the same food as human beings. But as they grew larger and stronger, their appetites grew as well. They began to eat enormous amounts of food. They consumed everything that people could produce. They ate all the crops from the fields. They killed and ate all the animals. Soon, there was not enough food left for the regular human beings. When the food ran out, the Nephilim did something that shocked everyone. They began to eat people. These giants saw human beings as nothing more than food. They hunted men, women, and children like animals. They roasted them over fires and devoured them. The earth became a place of terror and horror. The sight of these man-eating giants filled people with fear like they had never known before. Parents hid their children in caves and underground tunnels. Families fled from their homes and tried to find places where the giants could not find them. But the Nephilim were too strong and too fast. There was nowhere to hide from them. The violence of the Nephilim was not random or accidental. They seemed to enjoy causing pain and suffering. They took pleasure in the fear of their victims. They competed with each other to see who could be the most cruel and destructive. The earth became filled with the screams of their victims and the sound of violence and death. But the giants were not the only problem. The Watchers themselves were also causing terrible damage to the world. These fallen angels had brought with them knowledge that human beings were never supposed to have. They began to teach people secrets that would corrupt them and lead them away from God. Azazel was the worst of all the Watchers when it came to sharing forbidden knowledge. He taught human beings how to make weapons of war. Before the Watchers came to Earth, people had simple tools for farming and hunting. They used sticks and stones to defend themselves. But Azazel showed them how to make swords and knives and shields. He taught them about metals and how to work with them to make instruments of death. Azazel also taught women about cosmetics and jewelry. He showed them how to paint their faces and decorate their bodies to make themselves more attractive. This might not sound like a terrible thing, but it led to vanity and pride. Women began to focus more on their appearance than on their character. They started competing with each other and becoming jealous and bitter. Other Watchers taught different kinds of forbidden knowledge. Some taught about astrology and fortune-telling. They showed people how to read the stars and try to predict the future. This led people to worship the stars instead of God. They began to believe that their lives were controlled by the movements of planets and constellations, rather than by the will of their Creator. Still other Watchers taught about magic and sorcery. They showed people how to make potions and cast spells. They revealed the secrets of herbs and plants that could be used to poison enemies or control other people's minds. They taught about charms and curses and rituals that were designed to give people power over others. Some of the fallen angels taught people about the secrets of the earth itself. They showed them where to find precious metals and gems. They revealed knowledge about mining and crafting that made some people very wealthy while others remained poor. This led to inequality and greed and conflict between different groups of people. All of this forbidden knowledge spread like a disease throughout the human population. People became obsessed with wealth and power and pleasure. They forgot about God and began to worship the Watchers instead. They offered sacrifices to these fallen angels and built temples in their honor. They treated the Watchers like gods and obeyed their every command. The corruption spread faster and faster. Children grew up learning about violence and magic instead of righteousness and truth. Families were torn apart by jealousy and greed. Communities were destroyed by warfare and conflict. The entire world was becoming a place of darkness and evil. Meanwhile, the Nephilim Giants continued to grow in number and in violence. They built their own cities where they ruled over human beings like tyrants. They demanded tribute and worship from the people they had not yet eaten. They forced people to serve them and provide for their enormous appetites. The giants also began to fight among themselves. Different groups of Nephilim went to war against each other, trying to claim territory and resources. These battles were terrible to behold. Giants wielding massive weapons clashed in combat that shook the very foundations of the earth. Their warfare was so violent that it damaged the land itself and made it difficult for anything to grow. As all of this chaos and destruction was happening on earth, the good angels in heaven were watching with growing alarm. They saw what the Watchers had done and how their rebellion was destroying the world that God had created. They witnessed the suffering of innocent people and the corruption that was spreading like poison through humanity. 4 of the archangels decided that they had to do something. Their names were Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. These were some of the most powerful and trusted angels in all of heaven. They had remained loyal to God while the Watchers had fallen into sin. Now they felt compelled to report what was happening on earth and ask for God's intervention. The archangels came before the throne of the Most High God and told him everything they had seen. They described the rebellion of the Watchers and their marriages to human women. They reported on the birth of the giant Nephilim and their terrible acts of violence and cannibalism. They explained how forbidden knowledge was corrupting humanity and leading people away from righteousness. God already knew what was happening on earth, of course. Nothing could be hidden from his sight. But he listened to the reports of the archangels because he wanted them to understand the seriousness of the situation. He wanted them to see how the rebellion of the Watchers was affecting not just the fallen angels themselves, but all of creation. As God considered what needed to be done about this terrible situation, he thought of one man on earth who had remained faithful to him despite all the corruption around him. This man's name was Enoch. While other people were following the Watchers and learning their forbidden knowledge, Enoch had continued to walk with God and seek his will. Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah. He lived in a time when almost everyone on earth had turned away from God. But Enoch was different. He prayed every day and tried to live according to God's commandments. He refused to worship the Watchers or learn their secret knowledge. He remained pure and righteous in the middle of a corrupt and violent world. Because of Enoch's faithfulness, God had been revealing special visions and dreams to him. Enoch had seen things that no other human being had ever seen. He had been given glimpses of the spiritual world and understanding of God's plans for the future. But now God was going to show Enoch something even more amazing than anything he had experienced before. One day, as Enoch was praying in his home, he suddenly felt himself being lifted up from the earth. At first, he thought he was having another vision or dream, but this felt different. This felt completely real. He looked down and saw his physical body getting smaller and smaller as he rose higher and higher into the sky. Enoch was being taken on a journey through the heavens themselves. He was going to see things that would amaze and terrify him. He was going to stand in the presence of God Almighty and receive a message that would change the course of history. But first, he had to travel through layers of creation that no human being had ever experienced. As Enoch ascended through the first heaven, He saw the angels who controlled the weather and the seasons. He watched as they directed the wind and the rain and the snow. He saw storehouses filled with hail and lightning. He witnessed the angels who were responsible for making sure that spring followed winter and summer followed spring. In the second heaven, Enoch saw angels who were being punished for their sins. These were not the Watchers, but other angels who had disobeyed God in different ways. They were hanging in chains and suffering terrible torment. When they saw Enoch passing by, they begged him to pray for them and asked God to have mercy on their souls. The third heaven was a place of incredible beauty. Enoch saw gardens more beautiful than anything on earth. There were trees bearing fruit that looked like jewels. There were rivers of crystal clear water that sang as they flowed. This was the paradise where the souls of righteous people would go after they died. In the fourth heaven, Enoch encountered the angels who watched over the sun and the moon and the stars. He learned how these heavenly bodies moved in perfect order according to God's design. He saw that every star had its own angel assigned to guide its path through the sky. He understood that the entire universe was held together by the power and wisdom of God. The fifth heaven was filled with warrior angels who were preparing for a great battle. These were the angels who would one day fight against the forces of evil in the final conflict between good and darkness. They had weapons of spiritual fire and armor that gleamed like lightning. They were waiting for God's command to go forth and destroy his enemies. In the sixth heaven, Enoch encountered angels who spent all their time studying the law and wisdom of God. They had scrolls and books that contained all knowledge and understanding. They knew the past, present, and future. They understood the deepest mysteries of creation and the secret purposes of the Almighty. Finally, Enoch reached the seventh heaven, the highest level of all creation. This was where God himself dwelt in glory that was beyond description. As Enoch approached this sacred place, he began to tremble with fear and wonder. He felt completely unworthy to be in such a holy place. He was just a man, and he was about to meet his Creator face to face. The angels who had brought Enoch on this journey now clothed him with garments of glory so that he would be able to survive in God's presence. They anointed him with oil that made his skin shine like the sun. They gave him knowledge and understanding that transformed his mind and prepared him for what he was about to experience. When Enoch finally stood before the throne of God, he could barely comprehend what he was seeing. The throne was made of materials that do not exist on earth. It blazed with light that was brighter than 1,000 suns, yet it did not hurt Enoch's eyes to look at it. Around the throne were creatures with 6 wings who never stopped singing praises to God. God himself appeared to Enoch as a figure of indescribable majesty and power. His face shone like fire, but it was also filled with love and compassion. His voice was like the sound of many waters, yet it was gentle and kind. When he spoke to Enoch, every word carried the weight of absolute authority and truth. God told Enoch about the situation on earth with the Watchers and the Giants. He explained how the rebellion of the 200 angels had brought corruption and violence into the world. He described the suffering of innocent people and the way that forbidden knowledge was leading humanity away from righteousness and truth. Then God gave Enoch a message to deliver to the fallen watchers. This message would not be good news for the rebellious angels. God had decided that their punishment must be severe and permanent. They had abandoned their duties and corrupted the earth. They had created monsters and taught forbidden knowledge. Now they would face the consequences of their actions. God told Enoch that the watchers would be bound with chains and imprisoned in darkness until the final judgment. They would no longer be able to move freely on the earth or continue their evil work. They would spend thousands of years in torment, knowing that they had brought disaster upon themselves and upon the world. As for the giants, God revealed that they would be destroyed completely. Some of them would turn on each other and fight until they killed one another. Others would be wiped out by a great flood that would cover the entire earth. Not one of the Nephilim would survive to continue their reign of terror. God also told Enoch about his plan to cleanse the earth with water. He would send a flood that would destroy every living thing except for a small group of righteous people who would survive in a great boat. This boat would be built by a man named Noah, who was Enoch's own great-grandson. After receiving this message from God, Enoch was sent back to earth to deliver the news to the watchers. He found himself standing once again on solid ground, but he was forever changed by what he had experienced. He had seen the throne room of the universe. He had spoken with the Creator of all things. He carried within him knowledge and visions that were almost too much for a human mind to contain. Enoch sought out the watchers and found them living in their earthly homes with their human wives and giant children. When they saw him approaching, they could tell immediately that something was different about him. He glowed with a light that was not of this world. His eyes held depths of knowledge that they had never seen before. His very presence made them uncomfortable and afraid. The watchers had heard rumors that Enoch was a special servant of God. They knew that he had remained faithful while others had turned to follow them. They suspected that he might have been given some kind of message or vision. When Enoch began to speak, their worst fears were confirmed. Enoch delivered God's message of judgment to the fallen angels. He told them that their time of freedom was coming to an end. He explained that they would be bound and imprisoned for their rebellion. He warned them that their giant children would be destroyed and that the earth would be cleansed with a great flood. The watchers listened to Enoch's words with growing terror. They had known deep down that their rebellion would eventually be punished, but they had hoped that God might forgive them or forget about their sins. Now they realized that their judgment was certain and severe. They began to panic and look for some way to escape their fate. Semjaza, the leader of the watchers, fell on his face before Enoch and begged him to intercede with God on their behalf. He admitted that they had sinned and made terrible mistakes. He pleaded for mercy and forgiveness. He promised that they would change their ways and stop corrupting the earth if only God would spare them from punishment. The other watchers joined Semjaza in his pleas. They wept and cried out for mercy. They offered to undo all the damage they had done if that were possible. They promised to teach people righteousness instead of forbidden knowledge. They swore that they would serve God faithfully if He would give them another chance. Enoch felt compassion for the fallen angels, despite the terrible things they had done. He agreed to take their message of repentance back to God and ask for mercy on their behalf. He returned to his home and prayed earnestly, asking God to consider forgiving the Watchers and giving them an opportunity to make things right. But when Enoch brought this request before God, the answer was clear and final. The Watchers had made their choice when they abandoned their posts in heaven. They had corrupted the earth and created monsters that were destroying innocent people. Their punishment was just and necessary. There would be no mercy for the rebellious angels. God gave Enoch another message to take back to the Watchers. This time, the message was even more severe than before. Not only would the fallen angels be imprisoned and their giant children destroyed, but their punishment would serve as a warning to all other created beings about the consequences of rebellion against God. When Enoch delivered this final message to the Watchers, their despair was complete. They realized that there was no escape from their fate. They had gambled everything on their rebellion and lost. Now they would spend eternity suffering for their choices while remembering the glory and honor they had thrown away. As the judgment of the Watchers began, the earth experienced supernatural events that terrified everyone who witnessed them. Angels came down from heaven with chains of fire to bind the rebellious Watchers. The fallen angels were dragged away from their earthly homes and families to be imprisoned in dark places beneath the earth. The capture of the Watchers was traumatic for their human wives and giant children. The women had genuinely loved these mysterious beings who had married them. They did not fully understand that their husbands were fallen angels who had rebelled against God. When the Watchers were taken away in chains, the women wept and mourned as if their husbands had died. The Nephilim Giants were enraged by the imprisonment of their fathers. They went on a rampage of destruction that was worse than anything they had done before. They attacked human settlements with unprecedented fury. They destroyed everything in their path and killed anyone who tried to stop them. The earth shook under the violence of their rage, but God's plan for dealing with the giants was already in motion. As Enoch had been told in his vision, some of the Nephilim began to turn on each other. The violence that they had directed toward human beings now became focused on their own kind. Giant fought against giant in battles that were terrible to behold. These wars between the giants were unlike anything the earth had ever seen. The Nephilim used the weapons and fighting techniques that their fathers had taught them. They wielded massive swords and spears and battle axes. They threw boulders like ordinary men might throw stones. When they struck each other, the sound echoed across the landscape like thunder. The battles between the giants lasted for months and years. They fought over territory and resources and leadership. They formed armies and built fortresses. They developed strategies and tactics for defeating their enemies. But in the end, all their fighting accomplished was their own destruction. One by one, the mighty Nephilim fell in combat against their own brothers. Some of the giants did not die in battle against other Nephilim. Instead, they succumbed to a terrible hunger that drove them to even more horrific acts. They began to eat not just human beings, but each other. Giant cannibalized giant in feeding frenzies that were nauseating to witness. They consumed each other's flesh and drank each other's blood until very few of them remained alive. As the population of giants decreased through warfare and cannibalism, the remaining Nephilim became increasingly desperate and violent. They knew that their time was running out. They could sense that some great catastrophe was approaching. They lashed out at everything around them in their fear and rage, destroying what was left of human civilization. Meanwhile, God was preparing the final phase of his plan to cleanse the earth. He had chosen a righteous man named Noah to build a great boat that would preserve a small remnant of humanity and animal life through the flood that was coming. Noah was Enoch's great-grandson, and he had inherited his ancestors' faithfulness to God. Noah received detailed instructions from God about how to build the ark and what to put in it. He was told to gather pairs of every kind of animal so that life could continue after the flood waters receded. He was also told to prepare food and supplies for a long journey on the water. The ark would be home for Noah's family and the animals for more than a year. As Noah worked on building the ark, people mocked him and laughed at his warnings about the coming flood. The world had become so corrupt and violent that most people could not imagine God caring enough to judge their sins. They thought Noah was crazy for spending years building a giant boat when there was no ocean nearby. But a few people listened to Noah's preaching and believed his warnings about the judgment that was coming. These righteous individuals helped Noah prepare for the flood and tried to warn others about what was approaching. Most people ignored them, but their faithful witness was recorded by God and remembered in heaven. Finally, the day came when God told Noah that it was time to enter the ark with his family and all the animals. They had barely closed the door when the fountains of the great deep burst open and the windows of heaven were opened. Water came pouring down from the sky and gushing up from beneath the earth. The flood had begun. At first, people were not too concerned about the rain. They had seen storms before, and they expected this one to pass like all the others. But as the water continued to fall hour after hour and day after day, they began to realize that this was no ordinary storm. The water levels kept rising higher and higher until even the highest hills were covered. The remaining Nephilim giants tried to use their great strength to survive the flood. They climbed to the tops of mountains and tried to build shelters that would protect them from the rising waters. But their size and strength were no match for the power of God's judgment. One by one, even the mightiest giants were swept away and drowned in the flood. For 40 days and 40 nights, the rain continued to fall. The waters covered every mountain and every valley. Every living thing that breathed air was destroyed, except for those that were safe inside Noah's ark. The earth was completely cleansed of the corruption and violence that had filled it since the rebellion of the Watchers. When the flood waters finally began to recede, they revealed a world that had been completely transformed. All the cities that the giants had built were gone. All the weapons and forbidden knowledge that the Watchers had brought to earth were washed away. The earth was clean and new, ready for a fresh start with the small family of righteous people who had survived in the ark. But what happened to Enoch during all of this? The Bible tells us that God took Enoch up to heaven before the flood ever came. Because of his faithfulness and his special role as God's messenger, Enoch was spared from having to witness the destruction of the world. He was translated directly into heaven, where he continues to serve God to this day. Before his translation, however, Enoch wrote down everything he had seen and experienced. He recorded his visions of heaven and his conversations with God. He described the rebellion of the Watchers and the birth of the giants. He documented the forbidden knowledge that had corrupted humanity and the judgment that had been pronounced upon the fallen angels. Enoch's writings were preserved through the flood by Noah and his family. These books contained information that was not found anywhere else in the world. They provided details about the spiritual realm and the battle between good and evil that most people knew nothing about. They explained the real reason why God had sent the flood and what had happened to cause such drastic action. For many centuries after the flood, Enoch's books were read and studied by people who wanted to understand the history of the world and God's plan for humanity. The books were considered holy and important. They were copied and passed down from generation to generation. Religious leaders and scholars treated them with great respect. But as time went on, some religious authorities began to have concerns about Enoch's writings. The books contained information that made some people uncomfortable. They described events and beings that seemed too fantastic to believe. They revealed details about angels and demons that some leaders thought were too dangerous for ordinary people to know about. The Book of Enoch described the fallen angels in great detail. It named their leaders and explained what each one had taught to humanity. It revealed that there were spiritual beings actively working to corrupt and destroy human lives. Some religious leaders worried that if people read these things, they might become too interested in the supernatural world or might try to contact these evil spirits themselves. The books also contained prophecies about the future that some authorities found troubling. Enoch had been shown visions of the end times and the final judgment of all created beings. These prophecies were very specific and detailed. Some religious leaders preferred that people focus on the present rather than worrying about future events that might never happen. Another concern was that Enoch's writings seemed to give him an authority that was almost equal to the prophets who had written the other books of the Bible. Enoch claimed to have stood in God's presence and received direct revelations from the Almighty. He described journeys through heaven that no other human being had ever experienced. Some religious authorities worried that this might make people think that Enoch was more important than he actually was. There were also political reasons why some leaders wanted to suppress Enoch's writings. The books contained strong messages about God's judgment on corruption and violence. They described how God had destroyed an entire civilization because of its wickedness. Some rulers and religious authorities who were themselves corrupt did not want people reading about how God punishes those who abuse their power. Gradually, different religious councils and authorities began to question whether Enoch's books should be considered part of the official scriptures. They debated about the authenticity of the writings and whether they were really inspired by God. They raised concerns about the fantastic nature of some of the events described in the books. Over time, most mainstream Jewish and Christian authorities decided to exclude the Book of Enoch from their official collections of Holy Scriptures. They continued to acknowledge that Enoch had been a righteous man who walked with God, but they questioned whether the books attributed to him were actually written by him or by later authors who used his name. The exclusion of Enoch's writings from the Bible was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. Different religious communities made different decisions at different times. Some groups continued to accept and study Enoch's books long after others had rejected them. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for example, still considers the Book of Enoch to be part of their biblical canon today. But in most of the Christian world, the Book of Enoch was eventually banned or discouraged. Copies of the books became rare and difficult to find. Many manuscripts were destroyed or hidden away in monastery libraries where ordinary people could not access them. The knowledge contained in Enoch's writings was effectively suppressed for more than 1,000 years. During this time, most people forgot about the detailed story of the Watchers and the Giants. They knew the basic facts from the brief references in the Book of Genesis, but they did not have access to Enoch's complete account of what had happened before the flood. The rich details about the fallen angels and their rebellion were lost to most of humanity. It was not until the 18th and 19th centuries that copies of the Book of Enoch began to be rediscovered and translated into modern languages. Scholars and archaeologists found manuscripts in Ethiopia and other places that had preserved Enoch's writings through the centuries. When these books were finally made available to the public again, people were amazed by what they contained. Modern readers were fascinated by Enoch's detailed descriptions of the spiritual realm and his account of the events that led to the Great Flood. The books provided answers to questions that people had wondered about for centuries. They explained mysteries that had puzzled biblical scholars and theologians. They offered insights into the nature of good and evil that were found nowhere else in ancient literature. Today, the Book of Enoch is widely available and can be read by anyone who is interested in learning about this ancient text. Scholars continue to debate its origins and authenticity, but most agree that it contains very old traditions and stories that provide valuable insights into ancient Jewish and Christian beliefs about the supernatural world. Whether or not one believes that the Book of Enoch was actually written by the biblical Enoch, it remains a powerful and influential work that has shaped human understanding of the conflict between good and evil. Its story of fallen angels and their giant offspring continues to capture the imagination of readers around the world. Its warnings about the consequences of rebellion against God remain relevant to every generation. The tale that Enoch recorded is more than just an ancient story. It is a warning about what happens when those who are given power and responsibility choose to use them for selfish purposes instead of serving others. It is a reminder that actions have consequences and that justice, though sometimes delayed, will eventually be served. It is an assurance that good will ultimately triumph over evil, no matter how dark things may seem for a time. Most importantly, Enoch's account reminds us that we are not alone in the universe. There are spiritual forces at work around us that we cannot see with our physical eyes. There is a great battle taking place between the forces of light and darkness, and every human being has a role to play in that conflict. We can choose to serve God and righteousness, or we can follow the path of rebellion and corruption that led to the destruction of the world in Enoch's time. The story of the Watchers and the Giants serves as both a warning and an encouragement. It warns us about the terrible consequences of turning away from God and following our own selfish desires. But it also encourages us by showing that God cares about justice and will not allow evil to triumph forever. Just as He cleansed the earth with the flood in ancient times, He will one day judge all evil and establish His kingdom of righteousness and peace. For those who choose to walk with God as Enoch did, the future holds promise and hope. Like Enoch, we can have a relationship with our Creator that transcends the limitations of this physical world. We can receive wisdom and understanding that comes from heaven. We can participate in God's plan to restore and redeem His creation. The ancient leaders who banned the Book of Enoch may have thought they were protecting people from dangerous knowledge, but perhaps what they were really afraid of was the power of truth itself. Enoch's writings remind us that there is more to reality than what we can see and touch. They challenge us to think about eternal things and to consider our own relationship with the God who created us. In the end, the story that terrified ancient leaders continues to speak to us today. It reminds us that we are part of a much larger story that began long before we were born and will continue long after we die. It challenges us to choose our side in the great conflict between good and evil. And it assures us that those who remain faithful to God, like Enoch, will ultimately share in His victory over all the forces of darkness that have plagued our world since the beginning of time.